I'm delighted to be able to give this session. It's one of my favourite sessions. I do an awful lot of training. Trained over 30,000 people in the UK for good clinical practice in particular, but this is a really satisfying session to do because it's quite astounding information. And I just wanted to say I haven't put this together. I've just adapted slides that exist for public good in many ways. So these slides are used all around the world by evangelists like me who want to sort of promulgate the information that's in this particular paper. So thanks. And if you want to find out more, the researchwaste.net website has most of the slides, a lot of videos and all the articles as well, all the papers that I'm going to be referencing today. So I haven't given you any literature because it's all on there and ready to access. And what I'm going to be talking about, hold on, make sure this works. No, stopped. Let's do it this way then. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about is a paper that was written in The Lancet in 2009 by these two gentlemen, Paul Glasziou, he's from Bond University, he's a GP that works in Bond University, and Ian Chalmers from Oxford. And they wrote a rather astounding paper that effectively said of the 240 billion US dollars that are spent every year on life sciences, a good proportion is probably wasted. Anybody want to hazard a guess? How much?
Depends on how you count it.
Well, true.
And it depends on what wasted means.
Yes, exactly. Anybody want to put a figure on it?
96.
Well, that would be pretty bad, but no, at the moment we believe, or the paper sort of said 85%. And the reason for this is because there are wastes in different stages, and those stages are cumulative. So you get a cumulative amount of waste as you go through the process. And the Lancet published this paper and were absolutely intrigued by it. And as a result of this paper, they commissioned a series of 5 other papers. They hired the really leading lights across the world in evidence-based medicine, the practitioners such as Ian and Paul, but also An Wen-chen from Canada and John Ioannis from Greece and various others. And their role was to look at each of the stages of waste that were promulgated in this paper and corroborate the evidence that was in the original paper, but also to find out gather more evidence, and also to come up with recommendations, not only for governments, which is certainly where the UK has certainly done a lot to take into account this particular, the recommendations that came out, and I'll explain some of that as we go through, but also for ethics committees and any other, if you like, stakeholder that might be involved in the process. Funders, journals, all have a role to play in ensuring that we make the most efficient use of the publicly funded, research that we do. So. These are the 5 stages of waste. And what we'll do is we'll send you this paper back. So, and I don't expect you to be seeing it from right there over the back, so I'm going to talk about it. But there are 5 stages of waste. The first one is really, are we acquiescing in unnecessary research? Well, that's the first question. And there are 2 components in this particular stage. First of all, are we addressing questions that are important to the end user, to patients and the public, if you like, or the carers? So are we addressing low priority questions is one thing that was discussed within the paper, but also are we including outcomes within our clinical trials that are important to patients? And there's quite a lot of evidence. I'll show you some of the evidence that suggests that not necessarily are we always meeting those expectations. So here's an example that's cited in this slide series. Osteoarthritis. The patient priorities are in red in terms of asking patients what they want to do with research, and the actual trials done are in blue. As you can see, patients got an awful lot of drug trials, but did they want drug trials? No, not necessarily. They really were interested in trying to find out more about knee replacement or education and advice. So there was definitely a mismatch in this particular paper in terms of what researchers wanted to research and what clinicians and patients felt was important to research. So that was the first concept. Outcomes. So I don't know if some of you have heard, but there are various international initiatives to try and standardize areas of research, and in particularly research outcomes. So we can get a standard set of outcomes for every therapeutic area. All primary research that's undertaken in this area uses those outcomes. And certainly OMERACT is the group that has been heavily involved in standardizing outcomes for rheumatoid arthritis. And they held a workshop with consumers, I think about 5 years ago. And they had their core set of outcomes, and then they held this workshop, and the priority treatment outcome that came out of the consumer involvement work wasn't even on their list. Anybody guess what it was?
Fatigue.
Yes, well done, yes, you know. So not pain, as everybody expected, but fatigue. So it just shows the difference in the importance of involving patients. I've also included this slide because I used to do a lot of work with the Institute of Psychiatry, where I belonged, in the UK, and one of the papers that came out of there showed how useful, in fact, consumer involvement or patient involvement in clinical trials can be. So I'm not saying that we can reproduce this for every therapeutic area, and I suspect mental health was a good place to do this study, but Ty Wilkes and Liam Ennis looked at all the high quality studies that were funded by the National Institute of Health Research, 374 of them by the looks of it, and looked at the levels of consumer involvement. Now, there's a slight difference again, it's actually a requirement of funding to involve consumers in the UK in the process of research, but quite often that's quite tokenistic, you know, putting a patient information leaflet under somebody's nose and saying, yeah, is it okay? That's often as far as it would go. But this paper actually looked at the level, the amount of consumer involvement was involved, and they ascertained that trials with significant amounts of consumer involvement were over 4 times more likely to recruit the required number of patients within the agreed time frame. So it was quite a powerful study, very, very, very interesting study, and again we're getting a lot of evidence base to show the benefits of consumer involvement. But that's a whole separate talk, I can't do that one today, so we'll move on. The second area on stage 1 was really, are we also doing redundant research? Redundant because somebody's already done it. Quite an incredible claim here, but 50% of studies are designed without reference to existing systematic reviews of research, let alone existing trials, which I think is quite incredible. And probably the most powerful and the best paper that I've ever seen written on this is from Karen Robinson. And what she showed is that over the 4 decades of randomized controlled trials, fewer than 25% of trials were cited by each preceding study. A median of 2 trials were cited, and as we say, systematic reviews that existed that were absolutely relevant to that research weren't cited. Really, I think there's a very big groundswell of information and a groundswell of movement to say, you know, really we need to be thinking about systematic reviews, because there is a human cost of failing to take into account systematic reviews of research. Advice on some life-saving therapies are delayed quite often for more than a decade, while other treatments are recommended long after good research has shown them to be harmful. And certainly the Cochrane collaboration logo is an example of that. So here we go. This I'm sure some of you know, but the blobogram here, or the forest plot that's in their logo, relates to research on premature babies and the use of steroids. Lots of inconclusive trials crossing the line, so physicians weren't adopting the use of steroids for very many years. When the systematic review occurred, you know, a very clear answer came out of that. And the argument is, if that had been done a few years earlier, many lives could have been saved. So that's an example of the former. Have we got any other? Yeah, sorry, I've got a few systematic reviews here because they're so pictorially exciting that I wanted to put a few in. But here's another example. So aprotamine. What this research waste initiative has showed is that by 1991 there was probably enough evidence for the use of aprotamine in perioperative surgery, and despite that, and despite a massive trial of nearly 1,800 patients, only 7 out of the 44 preceding trials that happened on the same question cited that systematic review. Now, what are researchers thinking? Repeating the same trial over and over again. What are funders doing to say, is this research really novel? Have we got the answer already or not? And I could also argue, what are ethics committees doing
And what are journals doing?
And what are journals doing? Precisely. In fact, the only journal that is doing anything at the moment is the Lancet. So the Lancet, the prerequisite for the Lancet now is there has to be, if you look at their guidance, it's on the net, you have to have a system, you have to do a systematic review, whether it's a proper systematic review, you have to absolutely have dredged all the evidence that exists on all primary research, and the Lancet also expect you to set your results in the context of a new systematic review when you're finished. And alone, out of all the journals, they're the only ones that actually have that as a prerequisite to all primary research that they publish. So here we go. An incredible waste of funds, an incredible, and from the ethics point of view, what we're doing by doing this is breaking that implicit contract with patients that their research is going to mean something, because none of that research meant anything. And then the other issue is, would you really have wanted to be a patient on any one of those trials in the placebo arm? I wouldn't. So again, there's that ethical issue. And it's not just clinical trials. Here we go, animal studies. I can't even count that number of lines in that the forest plot on the left there. So very, very similar issues. That was TPA activator and thrombolytic inclusion of models in stroke. Senna did a very nice job of looking at how many redundant bits of research were done there. And in epidemiological studies, I think one of my favourite examples is sudden infant death syndrome. We can bring in some famous literature, Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care. We've all used, well, I didn't, but a lot of others over the years have used that. But in probably 1970, evidence was starting to emerge of the dangers of putting babies on their tummies, and yet advice, very strong advice, was still in place late in the 90s, or early in the 90s, to say that's what we do. And Dr. Spock's book on childcare was still being published in the 80s and 90s. So very much, and in fact Gilbert, who wrote this paper, effectively commented in that paper, we calculate that if people were starting to change their practice here, 50,000 lives may have been saved. So it really is an ethical issue as well as a waste issue. And it's not just the lay press, books about childcare that are often delayed in terms of coming together. I quite like this. Antman et al. Put a nice paper together again about thrombolytic therapy to show that, pretty convincing argument back in 1975 for their use, but it's only here that routinely in textbooks experts are starting to say, yep, this is what we should be doing 10 years later. So really is quite an issue. Good. So that's systematic reviews and their use, as I'm sure most of you know. We're moving on to stage 2, which is really, are we undertaking research that successfully reduces bias, especially in clinical trials? 50% of trials fail to adequately reduce bias, and I think that's a tragedy, because what the research waste paper does is what some of the researchers did is they went back, talked to the authors, saw what was happening, and all the issues, all the methodological issues with their studies were easily fixable. So it's not necessary for this to be happening, which begs the question, are we giving our researchers access to the methodological expertise that they need to do these things properly? 50% of trials don't adequately reduce biases. And again, my couple of examples, randomization. Here we go, failing to randomize. This is, TENS in back pain. So for the trials that were randomized, 2 were positive, 15 negative. Trials that were not randomized, flip it around. Is that surprising? No, not really. So trials with inadequate methods are associated with bias. And I think one of the things I bleat on about when I'm doing talks to researchers is if we fail particularly to think about allocation concealment in our clinical trials. There are 5 papers now that show we could be overestimating treatment effects by 40%, 41%. That's not one paper. Quite a few of them have shown the same thing. So what we're doing, if we go back to this, right, is we're making treatments look a lot better than they are most of the time. It can go both ways, but quite often that's the outcome of failing to reduce bias. I won't talk about this trial too much, but the same with blinding. So there's two bits of research there that show completely different answers when trials are blinded and not blinded, or when systematic review analysis happens for blinded and non-blinded data. Second one is assessment. Assessment with the blinded physicians, non-blinded physicians in, multiple sclerosis. I think it was a cytophosphamide study. And again, completely opposite answers. So it has a big impact, generally. What else? Incongruent statistical findings. So here we go. And it's not, this particular issue is not, we're talking about big, high prestige journals. And yet the evidence showed of this group who went back and analysed and looked at p-values and looked at, how they came about, found rounding, transcription and typesetting errors in 38% of trials in Nature and 25% of trials in the BMJ. Okay, so moving on. I think, in fact, this stage was not in the original paper, but it was stuffed in later, and I'm sure some of you can relate to it. It's efficient research regulation and management, and the lack of efficient research regulation and management delaying good research being undertaken and delaying the outcomes of that research because the research itself is delayed. So it's one you can all relate to, so I haven't got many slides on this because I think we've all been aware of this. Certainly my experience coming from Europe is in 2004, the European Commission issued a clinical trials directive. So all 30 member states in Europe had to work to this directive, and it made no difference whether you were doing a trial with a first-in-man, monoclonal antibody, or whether you were doing a trial with a drug that's been around for donkey's years. The systems were the same for both. The requirements were the same, so there was a lack of proportionality in the whole process. And this is where I think the world has woken up. So there are lots of papers now, international papers. There's one very good one from the OECD saying and the WHO, saying we really need a much more proportionate research structure. And certainly the new regulation that's coming in next year in Europe is taking into account research that is in a much more proportionate way. So certainly there are moves in the right direction. Also, one of the things that I was involved in the UK was promulgating, especially for non-commercial trials, a risk-adapted approach for running those clinical trials. So what can you do different from a commercial trial? You can do different things. It's acceptable in many areas. So it's really making sure we're as streamlined and efficient in our non-commercial trials as we are in other areas. So all I will do is give you a couple of quotes, and this is my little dig at ethics committee. Sorry, shut your ears. The clinician who is convinced that certain treatment works will almost never find an ethicist in their path. They can tinker all they like in clinical care, in other words. But those who wonder and doubt and want to learn will stumble over piles of them. There we go. No comment. Also, as a result of that particular quote, I quite like Ian Chalmers' response to that. He also said, really this is ridiculous. The regulation of clinical practice and research should discriminate in favour of clinicians who wish to help resolve uncertainties rather than the reverse, which is, very common sense thing to say. Okay, and there are lots of examples emerging now of a more risk or a proportionate approach to running clinical trials and running research. I mentioned to some of the group earlier, there's a lot of work to enhance public acceptance of a simplified consent process for trials using marketed products that have been around for donkey's years. And basically you go to your GP, you're probably going to get one or the other, and you just stick it in a trial because we really don't know which is best. So the trial becomes the treatment. Where a true treatment uncertainty exists, the trial is the treatment. That should be embedded in the way we do healthcare. We resolve these uncertainties, and therefore the consent process should be simplified to make those trials logistically possible, because at the moment they're not. They're not. Large-scale resolution of treatment uncertainties is not an easy thing to do, and it's very, very costly to do it within the confines of a clinical trial. Good. So moving on to the next stage. I think most people are fairly familiar with this stage now, but I'll talk about it. But publication bias is absolutely right. What we're looking at is more than 50%, and this is over the last 4 decades. This isn't new. For the last 4 decades, 50% of research doesn't actually make it to the public domain. It's not published. Things are improving. Things are improving over the last 2 or 3 years. This was published because laws have come in now. So Europe and the US make it a legal requirement now to publish within 12 months of completing a study. And one of the things I'm working on with Oxford is trying to clarify to researchers, what does completing mean? Where does the start point? Where's that? And where is the mechanisms for allowing you to publish? So we've got a lot of work to do to make this easier for clinicians and researchers to do. But this is the requirement. So publishing within 12 months of your ability to start analysing your data. And very, very good systematic review in 2010 or 12, I think, showed that more than 50% of studies are never fully reported, and that positive results are twice as likely to be published as negative results, as I'm sure you know. Lots of reasons for that. I think I haven't put the slide in, but there's a lovely paper written by a chap called Eric Turner, who's an FDA assessor, and he wrote a paper on the 12 bog standard drugs that you get if you have depression, the 12 that are out there. And he said, basically, in order to get marketing authorizations in the US for those 12 drugs, there were about 75 trials that had to be, sent in to the FDA. And 38 of those trials were positive, and 36 of those trials were negative. What do you think was on the public domain? In other words, what could researchers access? 37 of the positive trials, 3 of the negative trials. So what do researchers see? A completely different picture. And that's what we're basing our healthcare on in a lot of cases. I mean, Tamiflu is the other great example. I'm sure you've all heard of that. But I was at the the parliamentary requirement. I was sitting in the stands at the back in the UK when the government were sitting there talking about Tamiflu and saying, well, what happened there then? Because we spent, in 2009, we spent $5 billion stockpiling Tamiflu in the UK. I think that was the process. And out of that $5 billion, what do we got? Because, again, a systematic review was conducted. Well, first of all, about I think 100 and something trials were not published on Tamiflu. Eventually, a Cochrane systematic review managed to get them all and do a systematic review of the use of Tamiflu. And basically what it showed was Tamiflu will reduce the length of time you have flu for half a day, but absolutely has no effect on the important things, whether you die or get pneumonia and the bad outcomes situation. And I remember one of the government representatives sort of saying, do you think we would have spent £5 billion just to stop people getting flu for half a day? No, and that's again from not publishing all the data. There are lots of issues here. I've given you examples of commercial trials, but guess what? Again, there is evidence from research on research that shows the same issues with academic research. It is not, apparently the issue is not that you cannot publish because journals won't accept negative data. Of course yes, unfortunately that's a problem with the system at the moment. It's more, they're never put for publication. They're never written up. So the issue is both, both ways. Okay. What's the issue with that? Unavoidable waste. I quite like the slide that the group used, quoting Thomas Edison, who said, "Young man, why would I feel like a failure? Why would I ever give up? I know definitively 2,000 ways that an electric light bulb will not work. Success is almost in my grasp." And he actually had to do another 3,000 tests, experiments, before he actually cracked it. But can you imagine the meticulous records he would have to have kept for his negative data, and how important they were to the final outcome? And I think this is what the group is saying. They're saying it is avoidable waste. Negative results is not avoidable waste. It is absolutely necessary waste. Of course we're going to have negative results, but those negative results are incredibly informative and incredibly important, because they stop people doing the same research, for one. So no or inadequate records is research waste. Okay, so moving on to the final step. For those trials that actually do get published, a good proportion of them are not sufficient for replication, or for making head nor tail of, in many ways. And I think I'll turn to a slide that they put in from Austin Bradford Hill, who says there's 4 questions that readers want to answer when they're reading a report of research. Why did you start? What did you do? What answers did you get? And what did it mean anyway? And I think that's it, isn't it? If we can achieve that with our research reporting, then that's where we're aiming for. Paul Glasgow has a lovely few slides on this, because he was a GP, and he practices, and he said he was looking at a paper. He said there's lots of papers on sodium reduction on reducing blood pressure. Yep, fine. He said there's one paper, it was the BMJ, that published a paper showing sodium reduction and effect on clinical outcomes. And he said it was fascinating, really important. What do I tell my patients about salt reduction? And he looked at the paper very diligently, and he says, 3 lines, focus groups were held, or something. And he said, well, what am I going to tell my patients? How does this help me do my job in many ways? That research was not very informative in terms of the methods that we used. And certainly as a result of issues like that, especially Dow Altman from Oxford and Chalmers and a group got together, and the Equator Network was developed, and the consort guidelines were put together. And if you've ever read the paper, it's a very good paper in all the big journals on the reasons why we should be using the consort guidelines to write our reports, because they're very informative. They tell us, and they're evidence-based as well. I'll talk about consort in a second. Okay, so who did I haven't cited this one, sorry, but there was a study looking at all the clinical trials in PubMed in 2006, 616 studies. 34% of reports describe the methods of allocation, which, as we've said, are so important in the outcomes and the credibility of that research. 53% only define primary outcome. And another bit of research shows that 50% of trials change their primary outcome halfway through their study, which actually explains the importance then of publishing protocols. And there's a big move to say we really have to be transparent. We have to publish our protocols so we can see what spin has been put on for any final reporting. And then 45% only reported sample size calculations. And again, it's not just clinical trials. Details of functional MRI studies for 241 studies were insufficient to allow replication. That's what that study showed. And looking at failure to replicate, here's an example. I think this was something like 50 preclinical studies. Bayer got hold of them, tried to replicate them. You could only replicate 36% of those studies. Similarly, Amgen took, I think, for oncology preclinical work, can only replicate 11% of those studies. Now that's a bit of an indictment. And I mentioned consort. It's an evidence-based minimum set of recommendations for reporting randomized controlled trials. But if you're not a clinical trialist, you're a person that does systematic reviews, epidemiological research, observational research, preclinical animal studies. If you go onto the Equation Network, which is where this sort of initiative comes from, you'll find reporting guidelines for all of them. And it is an internationally recognised set of guidelines which we should be promulgating. So I think that's it. I've got a few others there. I've got a few other slides. Oh no, I'll just give you this one. What might the issues be? And you know, the paper discusses recommendations. I said that to you earlier. And one of the things they cite in their paper is Peter Higgs of Higgs boson fame said he doubts if he would ever get a job these days, because he was an embarrassment to his university, because whenever every year when the university said how many publications have you got, he would reply none. So he wouldn't be able to survive. And that's one of the issues. You know, the reward system that's in place is publish or perish. So it is hardly surprising that there are influences on all of us, not just researchers, but journals want to make money. You know, they have a so they want impact rather than quality, possibly. That's the argument. So it's very much the system in general. And although there have been a lot of calls for a fundamental change in the way we do things, or the way that funders fund. Let me give you an example. So what's happened in the UK? I mentioned earlier 50% of research is not published. That is certainly not the case with the HTA programme. It's the largest funding mechanism in the UK for clinical trials, health technology assessment funding programmes, or one of the largest, and 98% publication rate for their trials. Why? Because they withheld some of the funding until after publication. Very simple mechanism. But in fact, it's not just that. According to the NIHR and the groups, it's actually because they're proactive. They know people leave, you know, investigators move on, you know, die, do all sorts of things. And so they are on the phone. They're saying they are auditing, they are contacting, they're bugging individuals. Say, what's happened? Where are you? You know, and apparently that's probably the most effective part of that mechanism. So I think there's a review of the NHMRC funding system at the moment, and I know people are on that. People are on that committee, and there are certainly a lot of lessons to be learned, I think, from that. Yeah, and this is I'll give you this one study. Ian Chalmers has always carried he's always carried a donor card, and not only does his donor card say, you know, give my body to research, it also says, look, if I'm ever unconscious because I've been in a car crash, shove me in a clinical trial if there's a treatment uncertainty, because it's purely selfish. Patients receiving treatments as participants in such trials seem to fare better than comparable patients receiving the same treatment outside trials. New technologies seem to be likely to be inferior as they are to be superior to existing alternatives. So randomization provides a very effective hedging strategy in the face of those evenly balanced odds. And thirdly, randomized controlled trials help me generate reliable information on which to base my future healthcare. So that's his rationale for why clinical trials should be really totally embedded within the healthcare system. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya, for the questions. I never had a Josh.
So you mentioned that new regulations in Europe that research has to be published within 12 months of finishing the research. So given that journals don't publish everything that's submitted to them, the onus has to be on the journals as much as on the researchers to make that happen. So are there things happening in that space?
There are two different, so thinking about dissemination of research, there are 4 ways. First of all, the registration of trial. You know, and I'm sure you've all come across the All Trials campaign. It's an international campaign, which the NHMRC signed up to, by the way, supposedly, saying that all trials should be published and all trials should be registered first and they're published. And if they're registered on clinicaltrials.gov, or ANZ-CTR, we've been talking, as what we've been doing within New South Wales, we're talking to ANZ-CTR and the group there, then the publication is a summary publication of the results. So if you look on clinicaltrials.gov, anybody can go there and register, doesn't matter, you're free, that is where you can publish, and they've got a framework in which you can put that information. So the advice is either go to clinicaltrials.gov. What ANZ-CTR are going to have to do is get you to upload a PDF at the moment, because there isn't the same functionality, if you like, as clinicaltrials.gov. But they may, develop it in the future. But we're thinking, that would be a mechanism. Because one of the things that I like to influence in New South Wales Health is the introduction of some metrics, so that we can actually see. How many trials are registered, how many trials are actually published? Because without any data, we can't actually say anything. We can't say we're doing well or badly. So we're trying to encourage that, and we're trying to give some support and a mechanism through ANZ-CTR if necessary, or clinicaltrials.gov for you to do that. So there's the summary reporting within 12 months, and then the final report is the full description of the methods and requirements and activities and outcomes of that study, which will be to the consort, mechanism. So you've got the summary and then the final.
Won't that be considered prior publication? If you've made the results publicly available on the internet before you've even submitted to
Good question.
Lancet or whatever, won't they say, you've published this already? Sorry.
They've all reassured researchers on their website that doesn't constitute prior. The reassurance is there. No. It's something that they've all signed up to. Well, they have to. It's a legal requirement now. In fact, can you imagine pharmaceutical companies? It was a big battle. The way it's worked is the European Commission have said, okay then, basically if you've got very commercially sensitive stuff, phase 1, 2 trial, you can delay that publication, but within 30 days of us giving you a marketing authorization, it's a legal requirement to publish. It's no longer commercially sensitive the minute you get marketing authorization. And that was a big battle, but that's what's happened.
And can I just extend that to the local environment? I don't know if any of you guys have noticed, but on your annual reporting form to our ethics committee, there is a clause that says, if you have any reason to update the clinical trials registry, please go and do it. And the reason I put that there is I heard a presentation about 4 years ago from the manager of that registry saying the biggest problem with the clinical trial registry is everybody else goes and registers their trial because of the condition of HREC approval. Nobody updates that registry.
I'm not surprised.
Because of the nightmare, or
Because it's very onerous.
It's very
It takes a
onerous.
lot of time and effort, and they come back with ridiculous bloody queries if you spell a word.
that's
Do you know, we had a meeting a few weeks ago with ANZ-CTR, I don't know the one you say, and but it was good discussions. The discussions were, how can we reduce the burden on researchers in terms of where they put stuff, so that if they put stuff in ANZ-CTR, they don't have to put stuff in a progress report. It just downloads somehow, and that's common sense. There is a lot. I'll say this: there is a lot of focus in New South Wales Health now on trying to reduce the burden on researchers, which is going to be tricky because, as I say, we've got a new. It's making sure that. Well, put it this way: what we're hoping to do with the new ethics and governance system that's coming out is to make it to ensure that researchers understand that whatever information they have to write is valuable, rather than complete waste of your time. And I think if we can achieve that, in other words, it has a purpose, it has an added value, then I'm happy for it to go into the religious system. If someone can't persuade me as a researcher in the past that I'm not just giving that to you to make your life easier and not mine, then I don't think it should go in. That's my views on that. That's the idea. So can we take opportunities to streamline the system by interoperability?
Yes, that may be one opportunity would be to get this clinical trials registry to interact with it.
Yes, exactly.
So we can get you into the information once and it's immediately transferable to from Regis presumably to the ANZ,
You know, and we,
CTR.
that's the hope. And Regis was there at that meeting because this is exactly what was being talked about. But we haven't got as far as, you know, knowing what the system's going to be. So it's all
Yeah.
blue sky vision, but you know, technically people are talking about it, so that's good news.
Yeah. And because, and theoretically then, taking this step further, that if Regis will talk to ANZ CTR, then when you do your annual report in Regis, you should transfer to the ANZ, or the relevant bit should transfer to the ANZ. But it probably won't be before I retire. More questions, Dana?
I was just going to make a comment really about the ethics committees because, you know, there is a lot of waste there and they approve a lot of studies, but they don't know what they don't know, I guess. You know, the application form is only so detailed and you know, it's an unenviable position to be in.
And it is a common. The thing is, it's not one entity. It's not one of the stakeholders that should be responsible. It should come from funding. You know, the funding bodies. It should come from the journals. It should come from the ethics committee. You know, that's the problem. We have to fix everything for this to work. We have to change the whole driver of publishing from, you know, high impact. Okay, your career is one step higher, to quality, you know, quality and reproducibility. And there is a lot of talk about that. I mean, people hate me coming as a Brit and talking about crash. I don't know if many of you know about crash, the crash studies. The Brits love the crash study. It was a study conducted tranexamic acid, and it saves the UK. The net health benefit of crash is more than the whole funding for research, so that's why they love it. And it was an exemplary trial because Ian Roberts and his team effectively realised there's a treatment uncertainty for the use of steroids in head injury. So what did they do? Systematic review. Conducted a systematic review, which definitely showed there was a treatment uncertainty. They then conducted crash. Showed we've been killing people for 30 years by using steroids. Fine. But what they did then is they set their results in the context of a new systematic review. So in thinking about translation, what they were able to do is that then, with this very powerful result, they went to the army and they persuaded them to start using, you know, and it was translated into practice within, you know, a very short time. So it's about, I'm quite clever in that respect, and that is the way to get research translated. So if we can build this into the requirements, because we're all talking about how do we get research translated. The problem is, the scientific community don't accumulate evidence very scientifically, do they? You know, it's just out there. How is anybody going to make head nor tail of the 1,000 papers that might come out of their therapeutic area? So it's about making it more digestible.
Well, I'd take a different view. If the research is really meaningful, you only need one paper.
True, occasionally.
In 100 patients, 50 randomised to this and 50 randomised to that, to show a benefit. Example, squamous cell carcinoma of the anus. Hasn't been a randomised trial in that disease, don't tell me guys, but probably for the last 30 years or so, until recently when we're trying to do something a bit better. So, you know, that was meaningful.
But where
a lot of the things we do have very small levels of meaningfulness, if you like. They're not meaningless, they're just very tiny. So to the majority of the community, they don't mean enough. So we don't implement them. That's really the problem. We're doing a lot of low value, low priority research that shows minimal differences that people are not willing to implement because the cost of implementing probably outweighs the benefit. That's the perception of the health system.
And if the system doesn't trust the results because, you know, the effective bias ratios are so high, they're also going to question, even if an interesting bit of research comes, they'll have to be able to reproduce it or understand how it was put together before they're going to implement it, which is human nature and it's the way it should be. So there's a lot to sort out, a lot to solve. I take my hat off to this group because they really, you know, put together a slide set that really shows the issues very clearly, which is why I love giving this presentation. But as I say, it takes more than you and I this group to solve the problems. But I think there is a will to move forward, certainly.
Yep. Thinking about the role that the funding bodies play and that idea where we're not doing enough work in terms of systematic reviews, is there any research that shows that funding bodies are biased towards funding interventions as opposed to funding reviews? Because that seems to be part of the problem, that we're not putting enough of our research endeavour into the systematic reviews.
I mean, the thing is, Australia is pretty, on the world stage, pretty damn good at funding system, at having expertise in conducting systematic reviews, if nothing else. I don't know if there's been research on that. I certainly know that this group are absolutely furious in the UK with the Wellcome Trust, which is a huge organisation that refused to accept the requirement for the importance of systematic reviews. And, every opportunity in Chalmers gets, he talks about that. But so it's a hearts and minds thing, as well as maybe it will be raised in the review of the NHMRC funding system.
I think systematic reviews can be biased and
Of course they can.
very incomplete, particularly the vast majority of ones that are coming out of China at the present time, and published in, not admittedly not in the Lancet or the New England Journal, but some low level.
Sure, of course that's going to be the case, and it's
My journal doesn't accept them anymore.
Yeah.
I think Paul Clerget's doing some work on trying to automate systematic reviews as well to remove bias.
That, absolutely, and make it easier to do. And that work is incredibly important. He's really excited about it. Saying can we get to a stage where they're easier to do because they cost so much money and take so much time.
Right.
So there must be an easy way to do it. And using technology, which we should be able to do to automate them, is a very exciting prospect.
One more question and I'll give it to Craig.
Sort of a question, but we've been talking about this a little bit in the health economics unit, but so many of these challenges are just economics, and they come down to behavioural economics. The reason why you do a research trial that's been done before is because you know the result, and you'll get a good result, and then that will allow you to publish a paper, and then that will allow you to continue to fund your research.
But that's all very nice and fine until you get a journal editor who says, this has already been published multiple times, we know the answer, this doesn't contribute to the literature. Which is going to happen more and more.
Well, let's hope so.
Your fastidiousness is not shared by everybody. So the reward system encourages it. So it's not just about sticks, it's about finding carrots that will encourage people to ask the right questions.
We're putting together some roles and responsibilities, and I got my hand slapped actually by the NHS. But they were saying,
Please tell us.
I was putting in ethics committees. You should be doing, you should be checking if you're doing this scientific period. You should be checking the novelty of this research, generalizability, this, that, and the other. I'm just like, what's that got to do with ethics committees?
A lot actually. In fact, we challenged the trial this week because we thought there was nothing novel in the question.
Yeah, interesting.
So I think ethics committees should be prepared to do that more often, because really, if the research being done on tens or thousands of patients isn't scientifically sound and worthwhile, then you're wasting them, your efforts, funders' money, everything.
Dave, I couldn't agree with you more, and that we do this, but I come back to Kath's point earlier. We can only evaluate what we're given.
Okay.
So, and given that ethics committees work extremely hard, our committee is probably one of the busiest in the state, and we have something like between 12 and 30 applications a month. So when we're given a list from the literature review, or we're given a statement that this is novel, we trust the researchers. Not that I'm saying they lie to us, but we do trust. And we do have some more diligent members, or they're more diligent, but some who have the time to go back and check the literature. And it's only them that comes to the fore that maybe, Yeah, we do check it, but we've only got as good as the information we get,
Yeah.
plus the time factor. So, whether the new HERA
I don't think
will
that's
have
gonna
some more.
No, I was really disappointed actually with.
Having completed one,
Yeah,
I think it reduces the amount of information that ethics committees will receive. You
The
know.
HERA?
Yep.
Oh, really?
I mean,
Yeah.
that's the great thing about the HERA, as far as or whatever it's called, is it allows the cross-referencing. So if it's in the protocol, you don't have to write it, which is great. You know.
Well, that's good, but it also means, you know, you don't actually have to explicitly say it to the ethics committee. You can just go, see page 75 to 145.
If there are
You know,
signatures
rely
on that
the ethics
protocol.
committee Then to go and dig out that precise piece of information.
Yeah, okay.
So it means it's going to be easiest for us to pull the wool over our eyes.
Yes.
Very good on the ethics committee. Sorry, I missed someone earlier, and this will be the last question. The lady here.
Yes, I was just making the point that actually Leonidas produced a paper where he said up to 60% of meta-analyses are conducted incorrectly with inferior results, or just outright incorrect methodology. And so if we're trying to base our research on a poorly conducted meta-analysis and systematic review, and I've been involved in doing systematic reviews, and it is hard work,
It is
and
great.
you're relying often on somebody's judgment of the importance of a piece of research. So that's yet again
Another bit of work to be doing, you know, to improve the quality of systematic reviews. Gosh, where's all this money going to come from?
Yeah, Tanya, where is the? Okay, so on that note, on that cheery note, we're not been in informal session to close, but please join us for lunch in the Hayley place, and Tanya will be hanging around until I decide to take it to the train. So, thanks for coming up.